Dear participants, many thanks for joining today's FRH Talk. The Future for Religious Heritage Network has organized this talk in the framework of the European Year of Skills. This European year is promoting all kinds of skills and competences, but specifically from our sector of religious heritage, we focus on the skills that interact with cultural heritage. FRH's mission, the safeguarding of Europe's religious heritage sites, could definitely not be carried out without the expert craft skills of artisans, technicians, and so on. From the restoration of ancient manuscripts, books, and artifacts, the woodwork and stonework also needed this expertise that is required for the maintenance of built heritage sites, also to the development of stained glass windows, musical instruments such as organs. There's a wide range of skills that are indispensable to ensure future generations can manage these heritage sites successfully. And some key issues are, of course, the transmission of knowledge, disappearing craft skills, issues with certifications nowadays. So there's a wide range of challenges. And it's my pleasure today to welcome the Heritage Crafts Association, Miss Mary Lewis. She's the Endangered Crafts Manager. She will start by presenting the Red List of Endangered Crafts. This is the 4th edition of this Red List, which identifies crafts that are in danger of their continuity is in danger. And Mr. Daniel Carpenter will follow suit. He's the Executive Director of Heritage Crafts Association, and he will explain a bit about the organization and about intangible cultural heritage and how it links with UNESCO. This will be followed by a short video and a short presentation of Madina Benvenuti. She's the founder and manager of Made in Europe, on a new project called CRAEFT that they will work together with the Heritage Crafts Association. And after that, we can have a Q&A. So please, Mary, you can begin.
Hello there. Thanks for inviting me here to speak today. My name is Mary Lewis. I'm the Endangered Crafts Manager with Heritage Crafts and the Red List Researcher. And I think Daniel's going to share my screen. Great, hopefully you can all see that. So the 4th edition of the Red List of Endangered Crafts is hot off the press. It's received a substantial amount of publicity in the British press, The Guardian, The Times, Radio 4, Radio 6, to name but a few. Some of you here might already be familiar with the Red List, but for those who aren't, I'll give a quick overview and then I'll spend a bit of time looking at some of the crafts that are featured this time around. So the Red List started life in 2015 when we were awarded funding for the Radcliffe Trust to survey those crafts most at risk of dying out. We're now on to our 4th round of research, and our huge thanks go to the Pilgrim Trust for the funding that's allowed us to continue this important work into its 4th research period. So when Heritage Crafts published the 1st edition of the Red List of Endangered Crafts back in 2017, it was hoped that with repetition, it would become a tool for monitoring the health of crafts and a source of evidence and advocacy to support this incredibly diverse and culturally rich sector. 6 years in, we can now point to examples of crafts that have fared better or worse since the research started, and even now tentatively attribute some of those positive changes to the Red List itself. It's this continuation that really adds value to this work and allows us not only to see the current situation, but the trends and health of all these widely varied craft occupations. So the choice of basing the research on the Red List methodology, such as that used by the Red List of Endangered Species, was a calculated one. It is inescapably negative, focusing on what is struggling rather than what is thriving. However, the thing I've come to realise while I've been working on this project is that we need to know what that baseline is in order to know what the opportunities are, otherwise they'll be lost before we've had a chance to even realise them. The Red List is increasingly recognised by the craft sector and by an external bodies as a baseline of evidence on which to build these opportunities and to ensure that this rich, diverse seed bank of skills that exists in all these studios, sheds and woodlands and workshops in the UK are celebrated and valued. The Red List has also given us a mandate to support the people who practice these crafts. So since 2019, we've supported 57 endangered crafts projects brought to us by the people who do them and have a passion for them. I'll come on to some of these in more detail later. So I'll be speaking today about a broad range of heritage crafts, including some that are particularly relevant to our religious heritage. But even with those that are less relevant, the challenges that they face are often very similar across the board for all different crafts. In 2021, tinsmithing was one of the most endangered crafts in the UK. So with support from the Endangered Crafts Fund and the virtual company of tinplate workers, we ran some 2-week-long masterclasses at the Museum of Making in Derby. And as a result, we now have several metalworking practitioners incorporating these skills into their businesses and continuing with their own development within the craft. It's not enough to take it off the critically endangered category altogether, but enough to prevent the extinction we feared. Previously, there were 2 professional tinsmiths working in the UK, and almost no skills transfer happening at all. So we're really happy that this skills transmission has started to happen again. We've also done some additional work with the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller communities in the UK, and we've learned about how Irish and Scottish traveller tinsmiths have, this has a particular cultural importance to their communities. Previously, these groups wouldn't have engaged with us, and we've been really grateful for the opportunity engaging with these communities has given to broaden our approach to craft in the UK in a way that's much more inclusive and equitable. So some craft have gained ground. One example of this is shinty stick making. You may not be familiar with those, but these are the sticks that are used to play the Scottish game of shinty. And I had this quote from a shinty stick maker. The situation has definitely changed. I will share with you a list of stick makers that have come into the sport over the last few years, mainly because of the work Heritage Crafts have done in highlighting the problems faced. Obviously, that's music to my ears and shows the power of where the Red List can help some of these very niche occupations get the recognition they deserve. Most importantly, he goes on to say they've trained new makers and have been able to put up their prices, which is crucial if all of these crafts are to survive. It's an exciting time for crafts, with awareness of our craft heritage growing all the time, but it's also an incredibly tough time to be a maker. So this edition comes on the back of COVID, the cost of living crisis, spiralling energy costs and Brexit, the effect, all of which have been felt very keenly by the craft sector. So materials imported from Europe have become prohibitively expensive or not available at all. The cost of running a kiln or a forge are eye-watering. People are having to make choices between heating their workshops and paying themselves a living wage. We know that craftspeople are creative and resilient, but they're only resilient up to a point, and they will need additional support if they are to survive. We've always talked about the cultural loss that's born every time a craft is lost. Over the last few years, we've begun to notice another phenomenon. We increasingly see how crafts operate with a degree of interdependence. We refer to it now as the ecosystem of craft. They form complex ecologies with associated skills, supply chains and economies of scale. So if we see one business close or one craft become extinct, it can have a knock-on effect across a range of other crafts and occupations. The loss of hand-blown sheet glass or antique glass is an example of this. So the last manufacturer in the UK, which is English Antique Glass, stopped production of sheet glass in early 2023. They're still making other glass products, but they've stopped making the flat glass for stained glass, which means that anyone doing stained glass restoration or uses very specialist flash glass in their work will have to source it from one of the only other 2 companies in the world. So there's one in France and one in Germany. Obviously, that's more expensive and more difficult to source. And this is one of the factors that's led to historic stained glass window making being added as an endangered craft in 2023. So historic stained glass has been added for a couple of very specific reasons. It's around, like I've said, around the availability of raw materials. There is an aging workforce, so a lot of our experienced historic stained glass workers are reaching retirement age. And it's around the availability of training opportunities. The British Society of Master Glass Painters are very concerned about this indeed, and are concerned that those people working at the very highest level, so those who could replace or install a large-scale window in a church or cathedral, will be coming, those people are dwindling and those companies are becoming fewer. Silk weaving. So silk weaving is an endangered craft that we added for the first time in 2023. There are now only 3 companies in the UK making silk fabric, one of which is a museum setting. To be honest, I'm not sure where ecclesiastical silk is sourced, or even if budgets allow it to be used at all anymore, but to source it from the UK would now be incredibly difficult. There are only 2 companies making bespoke silk brocade fabrics, of the kinds you might have found traditionally in robes and vestments. Until recently, as I've said, around supply chains, until recently, silk for weaving these fabrics was available wholesale in the UK, and now it isn't. So these examples of supply chain collapse and rising costs are becoming an increasing problem for these very niche crafts. The Red List is an evolving process, and as we've come to understand crafts more fully over the years, we've realised that we had a bit of a problem in recognising some crafts, particularly those with a cultural significance to specific groups and communities. So in response to this, we've embraced a new methodology that now allows us to include a new range of crafts that would have previously been excluded, such as canal art. For those who are not familiar with it, this is a folk art associated with canals in the UK. Previously, this would have been assessed on its skills, which is very similar to sign writing or painting, and not for its cultural value as an outsider art, a folk art, and a craft that's fundamental to the identity of the canal boat community. So this new approach, we feel, can only continue to add value to the Red List and the work it can do to advocate for craft. Crafts that were already on the Red List, such as the Jewish scribal art of sow fruit, are now much better served in this context of their community and their culture. So this is a very ancient and sacred practice that's been carried out in the UK for as long as Jewish communities have been settled here. It is both a religious practice and a highly skilled craft, from the calligraphy itself, to preparing kosher parchment, to ink making and sewing with sinew. Sow fruit was considered endangered in 2021, but has been relisted as viable in 2023. And this is due mainly to increased levels of communication and sharing of skills within the community itself, and more visibility for those practicing the craft, which is an important outcome itself. And this approach, our new approach to working with cultural significance of crafts, is also preparing the foundations for more ongoing work with other communities across the UK that have their own diverse cultures of craft. So let's have a look at the numbers. So 259 crafts now feature in the research, and yes, I do make contact with every single one. That's up from 244 featured in 2021. So these are all of the crafts. That includes all of the viable ones as well. So we always survey all the crafts to make sure that one hasn't slipped into the endangered category. We've lost one, so we've lost the mouth-blown sheet glass. So that's become extirpated or locally extinct, so extinct in the UK. 62 crafts are listed as critically endangered, 84 crafts are listed as endangered, and 112 crafts are deemed currently viable. Like I said, despite being classified as viable, we would never consider any other crafts to be risk-free, and we'll always continue to monitor all these crafts. And here's the list. You probably won't be able to read this because it's so small, but if you want to go to our website, you can download the full Red List report, and every craft has a page, has its own page on the website that details all the research and all the people we know about practicing each of these crafts. And I put them up there as a list like that because I think it just shows the sheer diversity and wealth of knowledge that this sector holds. So whilst each craft alone may only support a few people, as a body of crafts, we represent a huge sector and a huge number of people with skills and knowledge. So these all support people with jobs and livelihoods, and they're all holders of specialist skills and knowledge that make up this incredible sector. So it was hard to miss the display of heritage crafts that contributed to the recent coronation. We had heritage crafts members involved in gilding, goldsmithing, embroidery, wheelwrighting, coach building, millinery, tailoring, the list goes on. For example, each one of these plumes will have been made by hand by one of the 2 remaining plume makers in the UK. And the King continues to support our work with endangered crafts and funds the President's Award for one exceptional maker or business working in an endangered craft every year. A striking addition to the critically endangered list, this was actually back in 2021, was diamond cutting. There were also quite a lot of diamonds and other gems on show in the coronation. We associate diamonds with Hatton Garden and Birmingham's Jewellery Quarter, but you may be shocked to learn that there are fewer than 10 skilled diamond cutters in the UK today. And the pressure from overseas markets makes it increasingly difficult to run a viable business in one of the most expensive districts of our major cities. And we're seeing this, that craft businesses are being pushed out of cities by rental costs and just the cost of running a business in the city. This is gold work. So whilst gold work embroidery itself is not considered endangered, we still have some good training programs and lots of people doing it. The making of the gold thread, on the other hand, is incredibly endangered. So we have 2 remaining manufacturers of this thread who can supply the gold thread for a wide range of applications, including ecclesiastical, military, and contemporary artwork. So we have some amazing members doing some incredible contemporary work with gold thread. In 2022, we did some additional work in partnership with the Wooden Boat Builders Trade Association to take a deeper dive into traditional boat building skills. We do this each time we do the red list. Coming up, we're going to be looking at precious metals and some other crafts. So we held a symposium in Bristol that was attended by 50 boat builders and stakeholders, and we also carried out a survey to gather additional data. A key finding from this work was that a significant majority of boat builders felt that the traditional boat building skills were at risk, primarily due to a lack of funding for training and an ageing workforce. And this week we were devastated to learn that a fire at Underpool Yard in Bristol, the very place where we held our symposium, has destroyed quite a lot of this important maritime heritage and the workshops of several traditional boat building businesses. Traditional wooden boat building is now an endangered craft, and events like this just show, this incredible, horrible arson attack, just expose how vulnerable some of these crafts can be. So Daniel's going to come back to this shortly, but you may have heard us talk about how crafts contribute to our cultural heritage, particularly our intangible cultural heritage. And so these are aspects of our culture that need a human to enact them. But crafts don't exist as culturally independent. They're intrinsically linked to all other aspects of intangible heritage, such as folk dance, oral traditions and storytelling. And marionette making is being added to the red list, and we really hope that this will stimulate more people to learn this beautiful craft and raise the profile of string puppetry in the UK. Marionette making facilitates puppetry and performance. Without it, the puppets have little value, they have no voice. There are only 5 theatres left in the UK with marionette bridges, and it would be tragic to lose any more. So we hope by stimulating marionette making, hopefully we can stimulate more interest in the craft and in the performance. This is pigment making. So we talk a lot, many people do, about the intersection between art and craft. I'm not planning to go into that here because that's a whole different conversation, but there's no doubt that artistic practice is underpinned by a wide variety of craft-based skills. Pigment making has been added as an endangered craft. It's a craft that's actually growing in awareness amongst artists, with many people making pigments for use in their own work. However, the numbers of skilled practitioners with the knowledge to produce pigment on any kind of commercial scale are very low indeed. So if you wanted to go out and buy pigment, you'd be looking at maybe only a handful of makers. As I mentioned earlier on, we've been doing now a range of projects to support endangered crafts funds, endangered crafts practitioners. So this is Gillian Stewart. She was awarded a grant from the Endangered Craft Fund. She's a 4-edge painter and bookbinder. So 4-edge painting is the art of the disappearing painting on the 4 edges of books. So if you imagine a Bible on a lectern, it's that image that appears on the pages. We have 2 4-edge painters, 2 or 3 4-edge painters in the UK remaining. And she applied for a grant to learn how to edge gild books and how to develop her own 4-edge painting practice. So these are the very kinds of things that the Endangered Craft Fund can support. And also, this is Steve Hogarth. He's a steeplejack. So we mustn't forget the our building heritage. So we have a range of skills that underpin all of our building crafts. So he applied for a grant to learn historic leadwork and flint work. So he does all of his work off high ropes, and his aim is to cut the costs of things like scaffolding that can be very expensive for buildings to install, and hopefully solve some problems that might occur in buildings before they become a massive problem, and become very expensive to rectify. So we represent craft practitioners working in mending building crafts. This is encaustic tile making. That is not Westminster Palace, but you might be familiar with these sort of tiles that are used in buildings like the Palace of Westminster, and in religious buildings all over the UK and all over the world. But we have only one remaining practitioner, Craven Dunhill in Shropshire, who is now making these tiles for replacing and restoring historic floors. So to conclude, we are seeing a growing awareness of crafts, and this is really important. But if we really want craft skills to survive to the next generation, we need more people of all ages and diverse backgrounds to join the craft sector. New entrants and new ideas are crucial, and we want to ensure that there's high levels of skills and knowledge of current craftspeople are transferred in a way that continues to be useful and relevant into the future. So we're living in a time when authenticity of experience and our connection to the material world is increasingly complex and contested. And we would argue that in this context, we need crafts more than ever. Investment in training in the next generation is crucial if we want our craft heritage and our cultural heritage to survive to the next generation. I also just wanted to say a couple of words about co-production. So the Red List continues to exist because craftspeople want it, and they want their work to be acknowledged. I have craftspeople come to me now to lobby me to get crafts on the Red List because there's no other way that they are represented formally. So it recognises and celebrates specialist niche occupations that have no formal recognition anywhere else. And by surveying what we're at risk of losing, we're also in each case discovering potential to rediscover these skills in ways that can benefit the future. This is the 4th edition of the Red List and the 2nd that I've authored, but it's more accurate to say that this important resource for the craft sector is co-authored by very many contributors. So the words and the issues raised are not mine, and they're not heritage crafts. They are those of a massive range of craftspeople and stakeholders who've contributed to this research. And I will now hand over to Daniel to talk a little bit more about the work of heritage crafts.
Wonderful, thank you, Mary. I'm just going to carry straight on, if that's all right with everybody. So following Mary's presentation about the new edition of the Red List, I'm going to provide a little more context about our organisation and our work. As Mary said, my name's Daniel. I'm the Director of Heritage Crafts, which was founded as a non-profit organisation in 2010, set up to support and safeguard traditional craft skills within the UK, many of which were at risk of being lost as a result of a lack of funded training routes, the sustained exclusion of creative and haptic learning in schools, and a lack of public appreciation for vernacular culture. We're a non-profit organisation, and our aim is to support and safeguard traditional craft skills as part of our shared culture for the benefit of everyone in the UK. We define heritage crafts as any craft practice that requires a high degree of hand skill at the point of production and has been practiced for 2 or more generations, wherever that skill has originated from in the world. We're very much about the crafts that are in the UK now, not just those that originated here. We're a membership organisation with a membership of around 1,450, roughly 2/3 of whom are makers and the rest are people who support our aims. We receive no government funding and are funded purely through our membership, donations and grants from private trusts and foundations. We're also an accredited NGO for UNESCO in the field of intangible cultural heritage. So we realised in the early years of heritage crafts that the UK was falling far behind the rest of the world in its recognition of intangible cultural heritage, and is now one of only 12 of the 193 member states not to have ratified the 2003 UNESCO Convention on the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. The term intangible cultural heritage is an unfamiliar one to most of the UK population, but we describe it as the heritage that is embodied within people and that is manifest through a performance, whether that be a song or a dance, a festival, through a belief system, or through traditional craft practices. Whereas in the UK, our heritage sector is predominantly focused on the tangible, so things like museum artefacts, buildings and monuments, we know that in many other countries there is much more parity between material and living heritage, and as a result, a greater recognition of the importance of preserving these aspects of our culture. We continue to advocate for ratification of the convention with the UK government officials and politicians. In 2012, we were part of a consortium of organisations who worked on a research project called Mapping Heritage Crafts, which showed that the economic importance of heritage crafts in England was substantial. £4.4 billion gross value added, employing over 210,000 workers. Despite this size, it showed serious vulnerabilities in that it was an aging sector, with 80% of practitioners stating that they had made no plans to pass on their skills to the next generation. Entry routes into the sector for young people had been eroded over generations, and generally speaking, a craft career was rarely considered an option for school leavers. As a result of the existential threats facing heritage crafts, in 2007, as Mary said, we published the first edition of the Red List, which has now become our flagship project, attracting the attention of the media and general public like never before. The Red List is the first research of its kind in the UK to rank craft skills by the likelihood that they'll survive into the next generation using ICH safeguarding principles. The Red List uses a combination of quantitative and qualitative measures looking at the number of practitioners, the number of trainees, the momentum of change, and any particular threats the crafts are facing. The issues affecting craft viability are many and varied, and each craft has its unique issues that it's dealing with. However, we have been able to identify some commonalities across the Red List as a whole. The first common issue we have identified is that of education and training. Young people are emerging from school with relatively little experience of craft activities and even less of a sense that craft can be a viable career, with youngsters that show any inclination for crafts being funneled into a narrow band of subjects that aren't necessarily very hands-on. Beyond school, there is a lack of training options, with only around a quarter of the crafts that we cover having apprenticeship standards to allow trainers to access government funds to help pay their apprentices. Other issues include those listed on the screen, but all of them interact with each other, with a common story being that craftspeople are so busy servicing their niche market that they are unable to take time away from production in order to train someone, for fear that that market will evaporate in the meantime. Plus the financial burden of taking someone on when there is no way of drawing down government funding to do so. The list attracted extensive media coverage, as Mary mentioned, shining a light on heritage craft practices under threat from the identifiable issues. The cumulative effect of COVID-19, Brexit, the energy crisis sparked by the war in Ukraine, and the ensuing financial troubles have all had a brutal impact on many craft businesses already struggling to make ends meet. We have spoken to so many craftspeople who are having to make heartbreaking decisions between buying in materials, keeping their workshops powered, and paying themselves even a minimum wage. This is all on top of the pre-existing structural issues such as the lack of training routes and government financial support for training. We have found that the general public is very responsive when confronted with the cultural loss that is born every time a craft dies. And that is why the Red List project has been so much more successful than any of our other awareness-raising projects. When something is seen as ongoing, then only a few people seem to care about it. But when it is presented in the context of endangerment, as being on the verge of being lost, then people are much more motivated to support it, even if it's something that was previously unknown to them. There are elements of nostalgia and romanticism attached to this, and while we don't want nostalgia to be the main motivating factor for saving a craft, it's often a useful way of engaging with people at the start before we can then educate them about the potential of these skills to evolve and remain relevant to the next generation. The Red List has also been influential outside of the UK, with the Canadian Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador's Craft at Risk list on the left, and the Algarve region of Portugal's Red List of Endangered Artisan Activities on the right, both citing the UK Red List as inspiration. The Michelangelo Foundation, based in Geneva, has expressed an interest in providing funding so that we can create a toolkit of our methodology for organisations in other countries to create their own Red List projects. with the ultimate aim of one day connecting up the national lists to create a pan-European or even a global list of endangered craft skills, which we think would be fantastic. In 2019, we started a fund called the Endangered Craft Fund for practitioners to apply for small grants of up to £2,000 to enable them to deal with particular obstacles that they're facing, such as replacing a piece of equipment, developing a new route to market, or taking on an apprentice if they were already on the verge of doing so. 96% of our sector is made up of sole traders or micro businesses of 10 or fewer employees, operating marginally profitable businesses where they cannot afford to step away from production for any length of time. These small grants give them a bit of breathing space in order to make themselves more financially sustainable. We find that craftspeople rarely want ongoing subsidy. They would much rather compete within a free market economy, and the incentives to adapt to changing market demands often make these businesses more resilient. So here's a map of the 57 projects we have funded to date, including leather tanning with oak tree bark in Scotland, sail making in Glasgow and the Isle of Wight, and willow, crab and lobster pot making in Devon and Cornwall. You can view the full list of the projects on our website. We find that most successful practitioners of endangered crafts are the ones that are embracing an open door policy, whether that means inviting the public into their workshops to see behind the scenes or showing their making process on social media. People these days are not just interested in the crafted object, but in the whole narrative of the maker's life. Often makers are selling a vision of craftsmanship as much as the product itself. And by buying their work, the customers are feeling part of that story. By reaching out to a global audience through social media and being open to new partnerships, then opportunities and markets will arise that they would never have found otherwise. In the past, we have often encountered craftspeople who didn't want to share their trade secrets for fear of the competition gaining an advantage, and we still sometimes find that. But the most progressive and successful craftspeople have begun to realize that the global market is huge, and that encouraging others to take up a craft can only be a good thing in raising awareness and stimulating demand. It's been interesting through the course of our work to witness how craftspeople have begun to consider themselves not just the bearers of culture.
Orrery making is a very...
I'm on the wrong slide, but I'll just leave it there for a second. It has been interesting through the course of this work to witness how craftspeople have begun to consider themselves not just as bearers of culture, but as embodied living heritage in their own right. Crafts have, over centuries, been the poor relation to fine arts when it comes to the respective status of cultural activities. This is undoubtedly true in part to the British class system of working class vernacular activities being excluded from the cultural canon by gatekeepers invariably made up of the upper or upper middle classes. The social levelling of the 20th century has thankfully reduced many of these distinctions, but their legacy lives on in the infrastructure of cultural policy, including the ways in which tangible heritage, in the form of museum artifacts gathered through colonialism and the large houses funded by enslaved or indentured labour, still have more status than the intangible heritage of working communities. Craftspeople increasingly are seeing themselves as cultural agents, partly as a result of our work on the Red List and of raising awareness of the concept of intangible cultural heritage. An interesting effect of this is that practitioners of endangered crafts are seeing themselves as bearers of rare knowledge, something they might not have considered before being featured on the Red List. We try to ensure that they don't bear this responsibility too heavily, as we wouldn't want it to feel like a burden, but rather an opportunity. So I've included a short film featuring two people who you saw on screen just a second ago, who are Staines & Son orrery makers who make beautifully intricate model solar systems. It's just 3 minutes, so hopefully we've got time to quickly play that.
Very rare profession. There's not many people in the world that do it, just a handful. And I feel very lucky and privileged to be able to do it now.
I suppose it's the old story of the eternal dreamer. In the mid-60s, I served an apprenticeship as a toolmaker and precision machinist, and that was for 5 years. I realised that some of the things I'm making had really beautiful forms, and they weren't just functional tools, which they were, but they also had a definite artistic quality about them. When I retired from my business, I started to make model steam engines as a hobby. I went to an auction in London at Christie's in Knightsbridge, and I saw for the first time an orrery, and I looked at it and I thought, that is fantastic. I would really like to make that. And so I went off and I did some research and I made my first orrery.
I remember the first orrery that my father made vividly. I had no idea what it was. There's no manual to orrery making, there's no school to orrery making. The only way you become better is by making mistakes. So we cut the gears using a gear cutter that we've made ourselves, cut the teeth into lots of different diameter gears. The worm wheel is made from bronze. The reason they're made from bronze is naturally lubricating. I couldn't actually describe the feeling of what it's like to crank the handle and watch the planets turn. Sometimes you could find yourself there for quite a while, just turning and turning the handle and watching all the planets and moons move.
I don't think there is one part which is particularly difficult. They all have to be precise or it just won't work. The gearing is so high, if you just rest your finger on any of the planets, the whole orrery just shudders to a standstill. Everything else is decorative or just serves as a carriage to put the gears on.
My nephew won first prize at school in the science fair for an orrery that we collaborated on. A craft passed down from family member to family member is quite a rare thing nowadays. And I hope to pass the craft on through my family, just as my father passed it on to me.
Each orrery that I make is just a stage upon a journey, and the journey's end can never be reached because the universe is so vast that no human being or race of people or any group of planets, if they were inhabited, could ever produce machines that would reproduce the universe. It's just the universe.
And that was a short video we produced with the Michelangelo Foundation, who I mentioned before. So traditional craftspeople don't generally need subsidy or funding to do what they do. They just need some of the barriers that they are facing removed. This includes the financial burden of transmitting the skills to the next generation, something we believe government should invest in as part of ensuring that the future working population have a diverse and therefore economically resilient range of skills. Craftspeople need a general public educated in the concepts of value and quality, so we think the exclusion of creative subjects in schools should be reversed. And if we really believe in the cultural importance of these crafts, we should also be considering relieving the tax burden on small businesses. Plus, ratifying the UNESCO Convention would be an important symbolic move in indicating belief in the importance of heritage crafts in the UK. So I hope that's been useful. Hopefully we can answer any questions you might have, maybe after Madina's spoken. But in case we run out of time, please do contact us if you have any follow-up questions at the email addresses on screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these wonderful presentations. They're both shocking, but also inspiring. The Red List of Endangered Crafts automatically made me think of the IUCN Red List of Endangered Species. And in the same way that we're seeing this crafts as endangered, critically endangered, extinct in a country, it really shows that apart from this biodiversity and environmental crisis the world faces, we also face this loss of craft diversity and the very existence of a very significant part of our cultural heritage. Thankfully, you also suggested some solutions and ways forward in tackling this challenge. One of the foremost, of course, raising awareness on the topic so people know what the challenge is, and then removing barriers from existing craftspeople and educating creative subjects in school is a possible way forward. Thanks so much for both of your presentations. Now we'll have a brief video and a brief presentation by Madina Benvenuti, the founder and manager of Madin Europe, on this joint project. They will work with the Heritage Crafts Association called CRAEFT. So it's a project they're working on. Go ahead, Madina.
Thank you very much, Jordi. Well, as it was said, I'm Madina Benvenuti I'm actually in Italy, but we are based in Brussels. Madin Europe is a small company dedicated to the valorization of crafts, and we are proud partners of the CRAEFT. So it's like craft, but with an E, the CRAEFT project, which is led by a Greek partner. I think maybe he's in the public here. And we are going to see crafts through the spectrum of technology, because in this project we are bringing some technological answers to the need of spreading the voice about crafts, understanding crafts, capturing and recording gestures of craftspeople, and facilitating the training at a European level of young generation, but also adults in the craft sector. So there is a short video that I will ask Rocio to present, and then I will give you more information about the CRAEFT project.
Craft creation process goes far beyond what we see. The practitioners use their senses, their touch, their vision, and their hearing in order to create. And this is quite difficult to transfer to another person without the adequate training, and quite difficult to describe in words. CRAEFT will study how crafts professionals use their skills and mind to create products. We will try to use computational techniques to create assistive tools to boost creativity, support creation process, but as well as we will attempt to create new products that will help the survival of traditional craft. To assure achievement of its objectives, CRAEFT will implement its wide multidisciplinary approach on 4 different craft actions. Actions of free-forming, represented by pottery and glassmaking. Subtracting actions as metal engraving and stone sculpting. Adding action, represented by metal smithing. And lastly, interlocking actions as wool and cotton textiles and specific obus-on tapestry. The power of crafts, cultural heritage in general, reaches beyond our awareness. Being strongly intertwined with our territories, local resources, traditions, and sometimes even beliefs, they define us. As precisely put by Lesia Veronico, the founder of Ukrainian Vyshyvanka Day, cultural heritage, crafts, have a strong defensive functions. and they give answer to key question: who are we now?
Thank you very much, Rocio. I hope you had a better connection than mine because it was a bit interrupted, but at least I think you understood the concept. So as we saw in the video, the CRAEFT project aims at creating a roadmap towards a better understanding of crafts and at creating a digital documentation of crafting actions so that we can also recommend ways for a sustainable preservation of crafting techniques. The motivation we spoke about, well, I think Daniel and Mary spoke about this, is always the same. The number of practitioners is declining. The awareness of the society is not strong enough, and there is a serious problem of transmission to young generation. And I absolutely agree about the fact that crafts should be introduced in school at a very early stage all over Europe. So because practitioners are aging, many of these crafts may be lost, as the red list is proving. So it is urgent to capture gestures and to understand these gestures, which are connecting the hands with the mind of the craftspeople. So this is what CRAEFT, through digital technologies and through computer science, is trying to do. So it will, the CRAEFT will propose computer-aided education and training. It will provide immersive virtual craft experiences that will integrate haptics and simulation of crafting workflows. And it will facilitate and widen the access to adults and young people to crafts. It will support material saving and reduction of energy consumption, of course, because one part, we don't want to replace education in crafts, which is, of course, practical and physical, but for some gestures, it can be possible to use computational digital solution to introduce and to give some overview on the gestures of craftspeople, especially when there are few craftspeople on the territory, and we want to, for example, there is this problem with the blown glass that you mentioned, Mary, before. For example, if there is one person still doing this in Europe or in Italy or wherever, then we could use this technique to reproduce the gestures, to save the gestures. So we have a documentation of these gestures so that if somebody wants to relearn this, we at least have some documentation on the gestures of this craft taken from other practitioners. So the strength of the CRAEFT project is precisely that the consortium is made of professionals from the craft sector, like Madina, for example, but also from anthropological sector, from education, from computer science, and of course from cultural heritage. So the CRAEFT project is not completely new because it's a sort of second round of another project that Forth was leading before, another Horizon project. It was a Mingate project, which had already this approach, but now it is empowering the approach and deepening it through new partners also that joined the consortium, like us, for example. And I would like just to mention, I think it is important to show how different partners with very different professional background can together have a very strong impact on the craft sector. So we have the CRFAV. The CRFAV is a French Center for Research and Training in Glass Crafts. They already tested the capturing of gestures that you saw in the video. You saw these people with these captors, and so that's precisely a technology that makes it possible to capture the gestures and understand these gestures. So CRFAV is already experiencing this because they have this GHOST project in which they're using it. Then Cora is a Danish company specialized in augmented reality, virtual reality. We have another project with them where we are creating the virtual reality tours with many practitioners, for example, boat makers, and it was nice to hear that you have this symposium in Bristol. So one of the videos that we are producing with them is about boat making, and so they will bring this knowledge. Then Made in Europe, we spoke about us. The CNAM is the French Conservatory of Arts and Crafts, specialized in vocational training. CITEM is in Spain, and they are specialists in the wood trades. CNR is an Italian institute, very much a research institute, very much involved in the cultural heritage research and preservation of cultural heritage and intangible heritage. They were members of the Mingay, of course. And then there are PIOP Foundation, which is also dedicated to crafts, the Association pour la Recherche et Développement Armin in France, and the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule in Zurich, which is also, of course, specialized in education. So this is really something that is very important to say. The craft sector is very fragmented, it's very wide, it has a lot of problems that were mentioned before. So it is very important to put energies together in order to bring solutions to save what has to be saved. And this may be a question for Daniel and Mary later, what has to be saved. So the very important thing is to collaborate. And this is why with CRAEFT, we are not only gathering partners from different backgrounds, but we are also trying to collaborate with other projects from the Horizon program. So we are in contact with other 3 Horizon projects in order to see what kind of synergies and collaboration we can establish. And we also try to collaborate with other projects under, for example, the Erasmus or even associations, organizations, etc. So it's really something that is necessary today to strengthen collaboration. And also, we don't have King Charles, but we have the European Commission so supporting us. So that's very, very good. It's a real opportunity that we have now to empower crafts. So I thank Daniel for being part of our expert committee, because I think that this is the beginning of a very beautiful and interesting collaboration where we may exchange about technology, methodology, objectives, and I think there's really room for very interesting collaboration. And that's it. I think it's everything. I just want you also to add something about the importance to valorize crafts, not only because of economy, tourism, but because of their territorial identity. You saw a few pictures at the end of the video about Ukrainian. We just paid a tribute to Ukrainian crafts, and it's very strong to see how much, for example, embroidery, these craftspeople there embroider a map of Ukraine with a different kind of embroidery of each region. And I think this is a fantastic symbol of how crafts are telling us the story of territories. And this is why I encourage always craftspeople not to go for globalization, but always for identity and local cultures. And so this is something that heritage crafts is really strong on, and we want also to strengthen the identities of each territory with this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Madina, for sharing this very exciting project that you work together on. Maybe now we can open the floor for any questions or comments you might have on today's presentations. So if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to. Yes, I see a question. Jacinta Ryder, please.
Yeah, hi, how are you? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm actually watching you from Ireland. So I don't know if you have the same problem over there where in schools there are lessening the subjects where there will be the humanities, and there's a huge push for STEM, for the science, the technology, the engineering and the maths. And it's really going to cause problems down the line, because we're going to lose our folklore, our culture, our crafts and our craft making. If everything is going to be science-minded and measured in a scientific formula, it changes our human aspect of how we engage with the world. And I know that is reflected in crafts, and I know this is wider than crafts, but do you find it a problem where you are, this push for STEM?
You, who is you? Europe, UK?
Wherever you're situated.
I can answer for Europe. I mean, I don't know everything about Europe, but we are here, we are European. Yes, this is absolutely true. There has been a kind of 3 or 4 decades in which crafts have been reduced to second choice by adults, by parents, by schools, by everybody. So that schools have progressive craft schools closed, and that teaching crafts in the schools have been replaced by computer. So children now learn computer at school, but they are better than their teachers. But this is because it's so intuitive that in fact, they don't need to learn computer. They already know it, but they don't learn crafts anymore. So this is a real problem. And what Daniel said before about the fact that the society is reacting when something is endangered, even though they don't know it before. That's a pity. I mean, do we already have to give alert signs to make the society react to this? It's true, but it's sad. We should really reintroduce the crafts in the school, also for well-being, because we all know that handwork is bringing well-being, and so that young people can get used to this. The fact that using the hands, there's nothing wrong about using the hands. Now it is accepted that pupils study art at school. That's trendy, that's now, but not crafts. Crafts is, if you declare that you want to become a craftsperson, it's changing now, but for a long time, it was a secondary choice. So it was not the good choice. So you're absolutely right. We are all facing this, and this is what we try to fight, because it's a very, I mean, there's no sense for this.
Yeah, it's almost like a purposeful, how would I say, it's almost like people are trying to create a disconnection from us to our world to become more science-minded, that we nearly lose our soul. If we're going to lose our culture and our heritage and our craft making, that's who we are as people. And I don't understand how that isn't seen, or that maybe there has to be a complete overhaul of education systems from the method that they are having to a more holistic approach of being human and the world we live in.
I think you're absolutely right, Jacinta. It's like we're being reduced to kind of units of economic production in a very, very narrow idea of what a functioning economy is. And I think with creative subjects in schools, we've obviously seen the narrowing of curriculum subjects over the last few decades, but I think it's very short-sighted, because the STEM subjects that are being taught only really appeal to people with a particular learning style, a mainstream learning style. We know that there are pupils in schools with a huge number of neurodiversities, different learning styles. By learning crafts, you're learning mathematics, you're learning physics, you're learning all the core curriculum subjects, but in an applied manner that appeals much more to people with different learning styles. A lot of people can read something in a book at any number of times, but actually doing it with your hands, it makes the information more accessible to them. So I think, yeah, I think it's been very short-sighted, and it needs a full reversal and an overhaul.
I was going to reflect the similar point to Daniel, which is that a lot of how we're basing education now is around quotas and numbers of learners. And if you can't achieve a quota of 100 learners on a course, then it's not considered viable. So we would argue that just because it's niche doesn't make it not important. So that's where we're coming from, trying to represent this diversity and breadth that exists within all of these occupations.
There is, I think, another point is also the perception that the society today has about the certifications. When you are, since there are not many schools for crafts, and as we saw, many crafts, you can learn many crafts only in a workshop. There's no certification for that. So that's not really recognized. And this is something that also we want to work on. And it's very important not to bring crafts to university. That's not the point, because it's another, it is another story, but to facilitate certifications so that craftspeople can say, okay, I have this skill. They can somehow prove it, because the society is asking for certification. And so they are just, even if they have the greatest capacity and knowledge and experience in one particular craft, it's not certified, and so they are in the middle of nowhere. So that's also very, very important. And another thing which is important is that long time ago, pupils had access to the workshops when they were 14, 15. Now it's not possible anymore because of security reasons, because the structure of our society and of the learning system is different. So their connection with crafts, what we can see now is that after many of the crafts people we work with, they start with another profession, and then later they realize that they wanted to be cabinet makers, etc. So sometimes it's a second career that they start later. So between 18 and 30 years old, for example, they don't consider crafts, but then COVID helped also for this. But then they realized that they wanted to do crafts. And probably you also, Mary and Daniel, can see this. Many craft people start later and not anymore as young people.
Yeah, they do, definitely. We have a lot of second career people, and that's absolutely fine. I think we have to also recognise that we're living a lot longer and that we have portfolio careers. So people might be doing things alongside other occupations, and the sector does have to be flexible enough to recognise these different working patterns now. We're probably never going to go back to a situation where people start at 15 and make sweep floors for the first 3 years. That's as the traditional apprenticeship might have been. We've got to recognise how crafts now coexist within a much more mobile working population, and people are going to be coming into it at different times. But obviously we still want to encourage young people into crafts as well and making it a viable career for them.
Yeah, can I go back to the point that was made about the quotas? And if a particular quota isn't met, then it's not viable to teach. But that ties in with the late learners also, because I think that quotas aren't being made because children aren't actually they don't realize the value. When they're at school, they don't know the value of the crafts or the process in the making of them. Their parents don't know the value, and the teachers are pushing another direction, so they won't feed into craft schools or universities when they don't have the value. But when they live as young adults, this may be where the shift comes in a later stage, because they start to understand the value at that point. But they've missed out on a whole lot of learning that they could have had if the value was actually instilled in them as young people, and it would be something that they could progress to at a younger age rather than late learners.
I think you're right. I think there's been a lost generation. So not only are young people not having the experience of craft or creative activities in schools, but their parents haven't increasingly now. So they've got no role model at home unless they've got a particularly active grandparent who is encouraging them to get involved. So we've been doing some work over the last year with young people, funded by the Dolverton Trust here in the UK. And we've been trying to seek out kind of people in that bridging generation, so people in their 20s who young people will be able to identify with culturally because they're not too different in age from them, and people that are making a real go of a craft career, and maybe combining that with social media. So two of the people we've profiled in the last year, a rug tufter and a four-edge painter, they consider themselves equally makers and content creators on platforms like TikTok and Instagram. And while that might be a new concept for us to get our heads around, it's really working for them, and they're working with brands and getting sponsorship deals as part of a way of diversifying their income, but still they're very focused on the craft skill and they're great advocates for it. So I think we do need to find those young adults who can really act as role models for the next generation, and yeah, really provide a platform for them.
If I may, on the subject of certifications, we recently spoke with the Marinelli bell maker family. It's the oldest ongoing running company in Italy. They've been making bells for 1,000 years. So that's a clear example of transmission of this knowledge within a family structure, for example. But when we asked about this topic of certification, they were very much against certification. They said they would never want to be certified. That's how they do things since forever, and they don't see the need to certify it. They wouldn't want it to be put into formal education. So how would you see this can be solved, this challenge of keeping this transmission of this craft knowledge while not fitting it within other certification or educational structures?
Who wants to jump in on that? I'll just say a lot of the people we speak to only find certification useful if it comes with funding, or if it's a route to funding. A lot of the time in these very niche crafts, people tend to know who the main practitioners are. And so if you've trained with somebody who's known within that sector, that comes with its own kind of status and authenticity. So a lot of the work we're doing in enabling these niche crafts to access funding is about developing qualifications and apprenticeship standards in order for them to access that funding. I think in bigger crafts where certification is more important in order to demonstrate your quality, that's a slightly different consideration. But yeah, there's no one size fits all in terms of certification, I think, in the UK heritage craft sector.
It's a very complex topic. Yeah. Very, very complex topic, because you're right. I know in Italy, I'm Italian, and certification means that then you have to face with the public calls, etc. So it's very complicated, because the heritage sector in Italy is quite it's very structured, but sometimes quite complicated. And so since they work on heritage, it if there is a certification, then it means that if you don't have the certification, you cannot work for heritage. So it's a bit complicated. So it's a wide problem. It's a really wide problem. But in certain cases, a certification of skills, like Daniel was saying, something that is proving that they have this kind of skills, but not. I mean, I leave this to policymakers and to people in charge of this, but there must be something in between, because today we also have a lot of craftspeople that do this as a hobby for a few years, and then they go and restore paintings, for example, or wall paintings, and so they are doing maybe sometimes damaging also the heritage. So it's about certifying that this person has the skills to do this. How to do it, it's a complex topic.
I would say in the UK, a lot of this this applies quite significantly to building crafts as well, because we find that individual craftspeople, sometimes who have the highest levels of skills, are excluded because they can't afford, or they don't have the capacity to get relevant certification. And so procurement policies from like local councils or heritage organisations automatically preclude them because they don't have the right certification. So often the bigger companies will get the jobs because they can afford to do that. So there is I think, like Madina says, probably some middle ground around procurement and things that could help people with these skills to get those jobs?
You know, Marinelli, we had this double interview. We did the same interview of a French bell maker. The company is Vögele, and they've been bell makers for 100 years, I don't know. These companies are established, so they don't need, of course, certification. But if a person who trained for 10 years or 15 years in this company wants to become a bell maker and create his own company, then it may be an issue, because Marinelli doesn't need. They do the bells for the Vatican. Vögele is doing bells for the Château de la Loire, so they don't care about certification probably. But if somebody new, imagine that Vögele or Marinelli close, and somebody wants to start this from nothing, then the certification is important. So.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments? We still have a few minutes. Maybe I would ask how you came up with the idea of making this list. So obviously it's a wonderful communication tool for raising awareness, for shocking the public into realizing what the problem is, but what inspired you to make this list?
So I think we were inspired by obviously the lists of animals and plant species and languages, and it kind of made sense that a sector where there were cultural phenomena that were at risk could be applied to this methodology. We also looked at Norway and India, where there were similar things happening. So the CRAEFT Institute in Norway had done work along those lines, and the Craft Revival Trust in India also had a list of craft skills at risk. And they representatives of those two organizations came to speak at our conference probably about 10 years ago now. And that was quite influential in helping us develop the methodology.
The UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage also encourage keeping a register, developing registers of heritage at risk. So it sort of works within that methodology as well.
And that's one of the arguments we make to the UK government when we're trying to encourage them to ratify the convention. Is that there's two elements, two statutory elements to a ratification. One is mapping, and the other is providing support for the most endangered elements. But with the mapping side, we've already done that for the domain of traditional craftsmanship, and we're more than happy to share our methodology for the other domains. So in a way, we're helping the government do its job. So there's less. Hopefully there's kind of less reason not to ratify the convention and join the rest of the international community.
Thank you very much. Any final question, and then we'll close the talk for today. For all those that join later, the recording will be available on the FRH YouTube channel, so feel free to see the whole thing there. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, I'd like to congratulate you, of course, for the lists, and many thanks to Mary Lewis, Daniel Carpenter, and Madina Benvenuti for your presentations. And thank you all for participating today.